3, 2, 1, now.
A technological masterpiece, Concorde turned heads throughout her magnificent career.
It was this amazing triumph. I mean, it was a triumph.
She flew on the edge of space at twice the speed of sound, outrunning even military jets.
Then the back boiler went on and yo!
Inside her luxurious cabin, passengers savoured haute cuisine and vintage champagne.
Enjoy yourselves!
It was an opportunity to step into another world.
I looked round and there was Ronnie Wood there. He went, hello.
Behind the glamour, Concorde's journey was one of intrigue, backstabbing, and catastrophe.
The world's most prestigious aircraft crashes.
It was an accident that should never, ever have happened.
This is the story of an aeroplane that went beyond pure mechanics to become a dream in the sky.
It's undeniable that it is the most glamorous and the most exciting and the most brilliant aircraft in the world.
This is the story of an aeroplane that doesn't exist. If it flies, well, flying in it will be like putting Granny in a missile, just 7 years from now.
In November 1962, two nations, France and Britain, came together with a plan, one that would set their course for the next 40 years. They wanted to build a supersonic airliner, a dream held since the end of the Second World War.
At Lancaster House, the aviation minister, Mr. Julien Aymeri, in company with the French ambassador, almost crooned in admiration over the brainchild of their two countries. On behalf of their governments, they signed the agreement for the joint development and production, a foretaste, perhaps, of common market cooperation.
They agreed to build two prototypes, one in Toulouse, France, and the other at Filton in Bristol.
Once it had that political backing, that political clearance, the funds were there, or so it seemed. Well, it shouldn't take long to get into the sky. 5 years and it would be off.
This was a treaty between two centuries-old rivals, so suspicions were high.
Our politicians didn't trust the French politicians, and so they insisted that if ever anybody went out, then the other side would have to pay the total until it was fully developed. So that meant that we couldn't pull out either.
This clause would dog British politicians for the next 10 years. For now, it was time to dig out those phrasebooks as engineers in Britain and France began work.
Monsieur Frappiche, how often do you go to Bristol?
I go into Bristol every 2 weeks, and I stay for 3 days. That depends on the work.
Of course, we had the language problem. A lot of the French spoke some form of English, whereas very few of the English spoke any French.
Both sides of the operation organised language classes for their workers.
Alors, où est-ce qu'il travaille en ce moment, Monsieur MacDonald?
Il travaille dans les ateliers.
Dans les ateliers, n'est-ce pas? Dans les ateliers.
The French part of the aircraft drawings were in French, and we all learned what a drill was, or what a bolt was, or nuts or split pins. We kind of got used to the French terms.
France's Concorde workers take their lunchtime break. And here at the Sud Aviation Works at Toulouse, it's very different indeed from the British Aircraft Corporation's canteen at Filton. And most French workmen like to take a glass of wine with their lunch.
But Filton engineers had to be careful that a lunchtime tipple didn't jeopardise delicate negotiations.
The technique was quite good because they would stonewall all morning, then give you a good lunch, and then you'd expect you to accept their proposal in the afternoon, which didn't work all the time. Well, I think it seldom worked. Might have done with the production people. I never found out from them, but that's scurrilous, I suppose, yeah.
Teams of engineers from France and Britain got on very well together. They liked a bit of raillery, and as they liked pushing each other, the French teased the British teased the French. So that competition amongst the engineers and the national prides involved led to a very successful machine.
Unlike their engineers, the politicians did fall out. Harold Wilson was furious with President de Gaulle for adding a letter E to the word Concorde, so he removed it. But de Gaulle put it back. In Bristol and Toulouse, the workers didn't give a flying fig.
Why is it a material? Well, some say Concorde, some say Concorde, so I don't think it makes any difference at all.
I don't care what they call it, as long as it's successful.
So long as it's got the craftsmanship in it and the ability of the men that's working on it to fly.
They can put 10 E's on it if they wish.
I think it was Tony Benn that said, look, let's put the E on Concorde and let's not worry about the little things. And I thought the E actually did the aircraft a favour. It was just a nice little touch.
A year on from the Anglo-French treaty, the first designs of Concorde were released. A wooden mock-up demonstrated the interior and the high-tech heat shield.
The orders came in very early. The aviation industry was very excited. Remember, supersonic flight was in its early days, but Concorde was the way forward. Everyone knew that.
The Concorde's basic design features have been established and its performance defined.
Cruising speed Mach 2.2 or 1,450 miles an hour.
To be able to fly at more than twice the speed of sound required huge leaps in aircraft design. The wings were perfected through months of exhaustive wind tunnel testing. The engines, taken from a military aircraft, were completely rebuilt, making them more than twice as powerful. The long streamlined nose was designed to cut through the air faster than any other passenger aircraft. But engineers had to come up with an ingenious solution for takeoff and landing.
People are always fascinated by the droop snoot, but I mean, the reality is that it was actually really very much necessary. And the whole object of the exercise of the droop snoot was to get that long needle nose out of the pilot's line of sight so that he could see the runway in front of him.
2 complete Concordes were being built in Filton and Toulouse. By 1966, large sections were being shipped from the factories on either side of the channel.
Security in those days was not as you would expect nowadays with such a sensitive project. So I would spend a lot of time during the day coming down with just a little clipboard with something scribbled on. And I'm sure my bosses used to think, where's Nigel? But I was, oh yeah, be downstairs with his clipboard. It was a passion and a pride and privilege to be actually working out here and see this aircraft which was being built from scratch to something which would become an icon of the 20th century.
Visiting the British Aircraft Corporation factory at Filton near Bristol, the Queen was to see for herself how the Anglo-French Concorde project was shaping, to the delight of the crowd. But it was during her tour the news came that increased costs for developing the 1,500-mile-an-hour jetliner had rocketed to an estimated £500 million.
Concorde had cost 5 times its original budget. To make matters worse, the airlines who'd ordered it were asking for expensive additions.
It was impossible, really, for Concorde not to go over budget, because the original idea was that Concorde would be this lightweight supersonic dart zipping across the Atlantic. Well, the VIPs on board wouldn't need much more, from an English point of view, than a sort of sandwich, a cup of tea and a glass of whiskey. But when other airlines looked at it, particularly the French, they said, no, this is a luxury aircraft.
Its passengers would want champagne, Bordeaux wine and haute cuisine. But all this excess was causing Concorde to put on weight, adding even more to the bill.
French never cared about the cost at all. It escalated substantially. But these things are really, when you get to this scale, they're political. And as far as the French were concerned, it was the grandeur of France. As far as the Treasury was concerned, it was, can you make a quick buck for tax cuts for the rich? I mean, that was the difference between the British and French attitude. But I'm proud of the fact that I stopped it being cancelled because the Treasury wanted to cancel it and the Cabinet wanted to cancel it.
The future of Concorde will be decided by Concorde in the course of this year.
They couldn't do this because, one, the French were committed to it, and if the British had truly pulled out, had done a kind of, Concorde Brexit, what would have happened then is the French would have sued the British.
None of this seemed to matter. On a glorious winter's day in 1967, when Concorde 001 was unveiled in France.
And the guests watch as the great hangar doors open to reveal 001, the first Concorde prototype.
The atmosphere was one of wild optimism and excitement for the future, where even the flight attendants were dressed for space travel. All this, and the plane hadn't even left the ground yet.
And here, a touch of symbolism. The two ministers jointly cut the ribbons to release the aircraft for its ceremonial rollout.
"18 months later, on March the 2nd, 1969, people across the world gathered round their TV sets to watch Concorde attempt flight for the first time. For the engineers on both sides, this was a nerve-wracking moment.
The main thought is, will everything keep going? Well, that was me. That was the kind of thinking I did. Other people shut their eyes, I think, in case it went wrong.
135. Rotate any second. Nose wheel well up. Smooth rotation continuing. Nose come up to 20 degrees. She's airborne. She flies. Concorde flies at last.
The flight at Toulouse was a great success, and a month later, it was Bristol's turn.
The whole length of the field was filled with people, employees, and up on the hill there are people watching. I chose to stand down where the aircraft was so I could hear the engine start up. Smoky Joe, as she was called at the time, because they were early production engines, quite smoky and dark smoke out the back. Began to turn around. The colleague I was with said we'd better move back because we're going to be affected by the jet blast. But I said, no, I'm going to stay here. I want to smell the kerosene. I want to get blown over. And the noise when she actually got onto the runway, opened the throttles, full power with reheat, it was a magnificent sight.
Concorde 002 flew for a whole 22 minutes, touching down at RAF Fairford, 50 miles away. It had been a wonderful first flight. History was made. But it was not until 1976 that commercial flights finally began. And to launch them, a huge publicity stunt involving international superstar Shirley Bassey.
You drift and you wander and you roam.
Flights to New York now took 3.5 hours instead of the usual 8, all for the princely sum of £431 one way. And passengers would discover that from the moment of arriving for a Concorde flight, this was a unique experience.
We couldn't believe it because there's a special Concorde lounge. It was just like going to a big feast. There was hors d'oeuvres and canopies, everything all laid out. It was just one, drink as much as, whatever, help yourself at the bar. George had a G&T, because he's the G&T king, and I had a coffee.
We would look at the passenger list, and if we knew they were regulars, we called them by their name. They loved that familiarity of coming on and knowing the crew.
I mean, most people think, you know, Concorde, that's a great big huge airplane, but when you actually get up close to it, it wasn't that big an aircraft. And especially when you get inside, it's quite narrow inside.
The ceiling was low and the windows were tiny. The windows they're not like windows on a normal plane, they were little tiny portholes.
Before takeoff, while we were taxiing out, we would take a bar order, we would try and offer champagne. Hot towels would be offered, as they are in first class.
It was just wonderful, wasn't it, George? The romantic.
Absolutely.
It was so romantic. I don't know why I used that word, but it was just fantastic. I felt like a film star. They made you feel like that.
I was quite scared. I think David Frost was on it, and I knew David, and I said, I'm a bit nervous about this, David. He said, oh, darling, don't be. I do it 3 times a week.
The sensation the passengers would be aware of more than anything else would be during the takeoff.
3, 2, 1, now.
The acceleration, you could really feel it. This great sort of surge of acceleration in the small of your back, and you knew that the airplane was accelerating rapidly down the runway.
The tray table in front of me fell down, so I was leaning forward trying to get this tray back. I don't know why I was caring about the tray, and I couldn't get forward. It felt like I was being pushed back in my seat.
I think when we took off about a 30-degree angle. But when he pressed the button, put the afterburners on, you practically stood on the tail. But oh, what a flight.
And it was so thrilling.
There was a wonderful moment where you just watched London go into a little dot, which was just fantastic.
And I was white-knuckling it, and then as soon as it took off, it was fantastic.
When Concorde flew faster than the speed of sound, anyone on the ground would hear a very loud sonic boom as she passed overhead. So she was only ever allowed to open up the throttle and fly supersonically over the sea.
And then the back boiler went on and yo!
And it just went on and on and on. And you could see the numbers ticking up on the speed. And it was quite hard to comprehend because there's some point where you think, I'm actually now going faster than a bullet.
When the Mach counter registered twice the speed of sound, I decided I'm going to the loo. And I went to the loo at Mach 2.
I was invited to go into the cockpit, and I was quite scared because I had heard so many scary things about Concorde, and to me it was a bit like going into space. It was surreal. It was amazing because all you could see was the blue sky, and you couldn't really see anything else.
You were sitting up there at 58,000 feet in this very calm, tranquil atmosphere. You're above the thunderstorms, you're above the jet streams, you're above everything that causes turbulence. You almost felt that you were just hanging there, suspended in space. I never got used to it. I would pinch myself in disbelief. We were doing 23 miles a minute.
We're actually flying at twice the speed of sound, and to be precise, 1,341 miles per hour, 11 miles up. And this is how smooth it can be, at more than twice the speed of sound.
Now at cruising height, the aperitifs and canapés consumed, passengers could start ordering from the menu. But this was not just any food. This was Concorde food.
The champagne flowed, the caviar came out, and the smoked salmon.
We would start the meal service with a pre-plated cold hors d'oeuvre. Then there was a choice of 3 hot main courses and a cold one.
And it was silver service. And the menu, I mean, we had lobster and chicken. You know, I don't go out and buy that very often.
Concorde was expensive and prestigious, with an in-flight service aimed at those with class. So there really was only one type of passenger, those who could afford it.
Investment bankers, fund managers were absolutely regular users of the airplane. They used it as a commuting tool.
When I'm doing it every week, I truly can just regard it as commuting to work. Speed is what it's all about for me, the ability to avoid these overnight flights, get to the other end fresh. And that's what this great plane does.
The next category were your film stars, celebrities, pop musicians.
This particular time in the 80s, I was doing a lot of traveling. I was working in LA, so it really made a huge difference in my life, being able to go on Concorde. It was very expensive, but sometimes it's worth investing in things that make you happy.
But there was another type of passenger, those who had saved up to enjoy the trip of a lifetime. They often got more than they were expecting.
I looked round and there was Ronnie Wood there. He went, hello. I said to him, Ronnie Wood. Well, as soon as I said that, another four came down. There's Mick Jagger and all the lot. So he came down and he hello, and he shook our hands, and I said, George, I've got to go to the loo, I won't be a minute. So with that, Mick Jagger got up and he followed me. Anyway, we waited outside and a person came out. He said to me, go on, Gwen. So I said, no, you go first. I didn't like to call him Mick, it seemed a bit presumptuous. So I said, you go in first. You sure? Yes. So, of course, he went in, came out, I went in. Of course, it was still warm. Oh, my word, came over quite unnecessary.
No matter how exciting things got, all too soon, the seatbelt sign would light up and Concorde would begin its descent.
By the time you'd had a few drinks and something to eat and maybe a tiny snooze, there you were in London, in the rain.
Concorde struck a chord with passengers and crew alike. For the next 2 decades, she would grow to become a national icon, finding herself at the heart of major public events. It seemed like the dream would go on forever.
I was retired and I'd been on the bus to Farnborough. As I got on the bus, somebody said the Concorde has crashed in France. And I told him not to be so bloody silly.
It was July the 25th, 2000, and the unthinkable had happened.
The world's most prestigious aircraft crashes. More than 100 people are dead.
I couldn't believe it, because it couldn't crash. It was too magical to crash. Do you know what I mean? It sounds childish, but in your mind it was just forever. And to think people that died, it was just dreadful.
The Air France Concorde was flying from Charles de Gaulle Airport bound for New York, with 100 holidaymakers and 9 crew on board. The official crash report showed that while picking up speed, the aircraft encountered a piece of metal on the runway.
The tyre encountered the piece of metal when the airplane was travelling at 185 miles an hour. But it didn't puncture the tyre in a conventional way. What it did was scalp the tyre. That flew up and hit the underside of the airplane with a tremendous amount of energy.
It set up a shockwave in the fuel tank.
It blew out a piece of metal and out came 100 litres a second of fuel.
This dreadful blowtorch of fuel, flaming fuel, and this led to the airplane just rearing up.
And once that had happened, really, sadly, the airplane and all those on board were doomed.
Air France and British Airways grounded their aircraft, while expensive safety modifications were made. They were relaunched in November 2001, but the world had moved on. 2 months before, the attacks on New York's Twin Towers had claimed 2,700 lives. air travel lost its appeal, and demand for Concorde flights plummeted. Added to that, maintenance costs were soaring. And so in April 2003, Concorde's retirement was announced.
It's the end for Concorde after 30 years of supersonic flying. British Airways and Air France will retire the plane in 6 months' time.
It was very, very moving because it was totally the end of an era. It was the end of an era.
On the 26th of November 2003, the last Concorde to fly returned to Bristol's Filton airfield, from where the first British flight took place in 1969. Concorde was coming home.
And of course we cried when we saw the Concorde, the last flight over the suspension bridge. I'm getting emotional now.
I loved it. Sadness because you knew it was going to be the last time, yeah.
I don't know quite what it is. There's something mysterious about Concorde. Most extraordinary, exceptional.
The whole country, in fact, probably the whole world, mourned its loss.
It changed many people's lives forever, I think.
Our whole experience with Concorde flying and the demise of Concorde has been with us all the time, really, and it's a tragedy. But weren't we lucky to have the opportunity to go on it?
Now the star of a new collection dedicated to flight, 50 years after she was unveiled, Concorde is a museum piece.
Look at 17A.
Designed for the elite.
This is what it was. I think I bumped my head last time.
Paid for by everyone.
Oh, 17 years and back to the same seat. On the same aircraft.
Beautiful, fast, noisy, expensive.
Oh, here's the infamous toilet. Many memories of that one.
A symbol of post-war hope for the future.
Yeah, my seat was always, I always used to be in the engineer's seat doing engine runs and things, but it's nice to sit up here. Yeah,
it was reverse thrust, reheat, and green for go, wasn't it?
Green for go, yeah.
Concorde lived a life of superlatives and contradictions. The white elephant that became a swan, but just a little too far ahead of her time.
Absolutely glorious. I think this aircraft used to take people 58, 60,000 feet, sipping champagne. The only other people at that height and speed. Fighter pilots.
We were just so ahead of the time, weren't we? There was nothing like this around.
Gets your memory bank going.
In awe. I'm in awe. Even now, I'm in awe of it.
There'll never be another one like it. It's a shame.
It's a wonderful sight. Never thought I'd see it again.
Let me take you on a little trip. My supersonic ship's at your disposal if you feel so inclined. Nobody gonna travel second class. There'll be equality and no suppression of minorities. Well, alright.